Throughout history, the sea has been both friend and foe of the British Isles. Storms at sea have repelled invaders, but they've also unleashed severe floods to attack the island shores and their communities. In 1953, while still recovering from the Second World War, the country needed no reminder that the defiant sea, by blunting the enemy advance, had evened the odds when the Battle of Britain had to be fought out in the skies. However, on the afternoon of the 31st of January 1953, no one listening to the gale-force winds could have known that a fearful surge flood was building off the east coast. The war had left a legacy the sea was about to exploit.
We're here at the flood memorial at Understanton, which commemorates the flood from the 31st of January 1953, which swept all along the east coast of Britain. The memorial here remembers those who died in this town and the surrounding villages on this coast, where in this village and the next village of Snetchesham, 65 people lost their lives. Along the whole east coast of Britain, there was 307 deaths that night in 1953.
A severe storm took its first lives that Saturday afternoon around 2 o'clock as the passenger ferry, the Princess Victoria, sank on its crossing from Scotland to Northern Ireland. As the storm passed around the north coast of Scotland and then down the east coast of Britain, it intensified in strength and combined with a high spring tide to leave many communities along the coast completely washed out. The storm made its first landfall at Spurn Head in Yorkshire around 4 p.m. that Saturday afternoon. And as the evening progressed, each village along the east coast of Britain had to deal independently with the deluge that approached. There was no national scale warning system in place, and the Meteorological Office forecast for that day, although warning of severe gale force winds, didn't give any clue to the severity of what was to unfold. Without a coordinated government plan for such a scale of flooding, with much of the communication lines across the area destroyed by the flood itself, as light came on Sunday morning, each individual community isolated by the waters had to deal with the deluge themselves. There were great stories of camaraderie as the communities pulled together to try and repair breaches before the next high tide. In the days that followed the flooding, the true scale and sheer devastation caused really came home, and some of the numbers from the period really highlight how big and unprecedented this flood was. 160,000 acres were flooded along the coast, 24,000 properties damaged, 1,200 sea defence breached, 46,000 livestock killed, 32,000 people evacuated, 440 deaths. And that was only the story for Britain. The Low Countries of Belgium and Netherlands had also been devastated by the floods. In the Netherlands alone, over 1,800 people were to lose their lives in this one storm.
It's quite poignant that the memorial here in Hunstanton, right next to the coast, sits opposite the War Memorial that commemorates those that died in both the First World War and the Second World War. Because many of the deaths along this coast that evening were attributable to the neglected flood defences that throughout the war had been converted or neglected in a battle to stop Hitler invading. And that evening it was actually the sea that was to cause such devastation.
Visiting the affected coast today, especially some of the smaller, sleepier villages such as Wells next to sea in Norfolk, one could be forgiven for thinking that little has changed in the 60 years between the floods. However, after the floods, the government was forced to commission a departmental committee to review why so many of its citizens had died that night. The report, published in 1954, highlighted the sheer inadequacies of many of the sea defences and the problems caused by having a lack of a national scale warning system. The recommendations made by the report can be seen up and down the east coast to this day. Here we see the tide recorder station at Wells Next to Sea, one of many set up in the years following the flood as part of a national network feeding measurements into the Met Office and Hydrographic Office, who then issue warnings about imminent coastal flooding. Also, in Wells here we see the newly completed flood wall, part of a vast scale and network of defences all along the coast. In addition now, warnings can be communicated via television, radio and the internet, as well as more traditional methods such as signs located along coastal communities. Whilst these vastly improved defences and warning systems mean that if a similar scale flood was to occur today, the chance of loss of life is much reduced, we cannot become complacent. There are still many lessons to be learned from events of 1953. One of the key findings of the report published after the floods showed how many of the deaths had been caused by vulnerable communities living in temporary housing because of post-war shortages. Yet today, along the North Norfolk coast in places like Hunstanton and Snettisham, whilst not there because of vulnerability and post-war shortages, we see many people holidaying in static caravans right next to the seashore. Also, considering the predicted increases in sea level due to climate change over the coming decades and the increased numbers of people living along this coast, we must understand that the threat of inundation is still very real. So whilst the government and government agencies such as the Environment Agency will continue to try and improve flood defences and flood warnings, even in times of economic recession, we must not forget why the east coast of Britain is littered with flood memorials and flood markers. On occasions like the 60th anniversary of this devastating event, I think it is every citizen's responsibility to commemorate and remember what happened that evening so that we do not become complacent and we ensure that such loss of life doesn't occur again.